Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Welcome to another Inspiration Wednesday. My name is Daryl Fleary with Trivantis. And today what we're going to talk about is how to create software simulations in Lectora, and specifically how to use the form objects that are available in Lectora to build very realistic looking software simulations. One thing that the advertised session said we were going to do that we're not going to do is to talk a great deal about using Snagit as a screen capture tool. There are other sessions on how to do fancy things with Snagit, which you can view out on our website. And today we're just going to refer to Snagit as a generic, if you will, generic screen capture tool. You can certainly use any screen capture tool that you have to accomplish what we're going to talk about today. Now, what I typically like to do when I begin these Inspiration Wednesday sessions is I usually like to start with an example, sort of Stephen Covey-ish, right? Begin with the end in mind, show you the full picture, and then we'll break it down and look at how the different components were put together. And after we go through all the steps to do that, we'll go under the hood in Lectora, take a look at the AWT file, and actually see how things are laid out there. All right, so let's start again with an example. So when we talk about building a software simulation in Lectora, what we're talking about is you have an application that you're teaching to your organization. Maybe it's a data entry application, maybe it's a time application or a project management application or an email application or whatever it is. And you need them to practice actually using that application in a simulated or safe environment where you can provide feedback. That's what we're talking about. So here's an example that I put together, and this looks like a typical application that you might have. You've got tabs across the top, you've got some fields you can put things in. So maybe here, this is fraud investigation number 77, and we're going to just toggle through these radio buttons, maybe put in a phone number. Let's put in a name and a first name. Now, this session sort of came about because a lot of our clients have often asked, how do we get people to input data in a Lectora field? So that's why we created this session today. So as you can see, all of this is actually real live data. If I pick up a business unit, say I'm going to pick finance here, I've now got my division choices associated with finance. If I pick human resources, I now have division choices associated with human resources, and so on. So all of this is possible in Lectora. You just have to kind of figure out what you're doing and take advantage of the fields available to you. So this is a simulation that you might do in your title. So what I want to do now then is kind of talk through how we did all of this. And the key to the whole thing is Lectora provides for you a bunch of form objects, what we call form objects. And you can see them up in your title bar. They look like this. And they are a form object, which we'll talk about in a minute, radio button groups, radio buttons, checkboxes, entry fields, drop-down lists, and list boxes. And by the way, everything I'm going to say today is, of course, in the Help or Information Center within Lectora. You can certainly find this information there as well. So let's take a look at this. Here on this blackboard, we have a radio group. And as you can see, as I make choices, it only picks one choice. Here we have some checkboxes that can be on and off, and those are independent. Here's a list box where you can pick one thing, or if you hold down the Control key, multiple things, or the Shift key, a range of things. Entry fields where you can type information such as a name or a date. You can have multi-line entry fields as well that are scrollable. And you can have drop-down lists. Now, if any of this looks familiar to you, and I hope it does, it's because these are the same form elements that are used in questions, right? If you have a multiple choice question, you've got essentially a radio group. Or it could be in the form of a drop-down list. If you have a multiple choice question with multiple correct answers, you will have checkboxes where they can pick all that apply. Or you might have it in the form of a list box where they can pick all that apply. If you have a fill-in-the-blank question or a short answer question, you have an entry field. Or if you have an essay question, you have an entry field perhaps with multi-line capability, so they can type a little bit more. So all of these objects you're probably used to already, using them in the format of a question. And that's going to be important. We'll circle back to that later. So there's nothing here that you haven't seen before. I promise you already there is no magic in what we're going to talk about today. So let's look then at how we actually did that simulation that I just showed you. This is what I did. This is that same form, a picture of our system screen, and we just did, in this case using Snagit, a screen capture of our system screen. Now in this particular case we're looking at the details panel, but we might be teaching in another chapter the details too, or the responsibility, or the notes, or whatever. So what I did was I took a screen capture of the application, and then once I had that screen capture, I erased in my image, because now it's an image file, right, just a screen capture, I erased all of the checkboxes and entry fields and radio buttons. So this is now just an image on my page. And over top of that image, I lay in the form field objects that Lectora has available to us. So this is a Lectora entry field here, Lectora drop list here, and here. Okay? A Lectora entry field here set to multi-line. Nothing you haven't seen before. Okay? So let me just go back a page. Actually, I'll go back a couple pages, and you can see the whole thing all laid on top of each other again. Exact same thing, just a screenshot in the background with Lectora fields laid over the top of the screenshot. Now I want to point out, you'll notice when I did the screen capture, some of the stuff over here wasn't captured. And I did that on purpose, just so I wanted to point out to you, if you have a need to be 508 compliant, then things that are listed, words that are listed in your screen capture obviously will not be picked up by a screen reader. So if you wanted to make this 508 compliant, you would actually take your screen capture to have the base look, if you will, and then lay all your text in with Lectora text, and that way it would be readable by a screen reader. So I'm going to go back forward again. Again, we've got our base image that we captured out of our screen, out of our application. We erased all the entry fields and overlaid them with Lectora objects. Now, that's actually not the order I do it in, by the way. The order I actually do it in is I do the screen capture with all of the entry fields and everything there, lay my Lectora objects on top so that I have them perfectly positioned, and then I edit the image to erase what's in the background. So this is what we're going to build today. So basically what you do, I may be repeating myself a little bit here. So we're going to start with our base image. We're going to add in radio groups that contain radio buttons, checkboxes, entry fields, drop-down lists, list boxes. Now you'll notice this third bullet, name the associated variables. All of these objects have a variable value associated with them. And the reason for that is how you can tell what has been entered into those fields. Just like when they answer a question, you know what their answer was because they manipulated those fields. Same thing if you're using those form objects outside of a question. And in that way, you can then run simulations with some conditional actions and determine whether or not they entered the information that you wanted them to information in the practice that you are providing them. Now another thing it notes here at the bottom of the page is create any conditional appearance situations. And by that we mean, as you recall, there was that set of drop lists between the division and the department, and what was in the department drop list changed based on the division that was selected. That's a little bit of a trick, and I'll show you how to do that as well in case you have something that has to be sort of, quote, dynamically, end quote, populated. All right, so let's walk through each of these form objects and talk about them and their values and so forth. All right, the first object that we're going to talk about is the entry field object. Again, you select that, that's this one right here. Has AB inside of a field. That's your entry field. When you add an entry field, you have the choice of adding a single line entry field, and you can determine how many characters they're allowed to key. So if you had, let's say, a field that only accepted 4 characters, you could limit it to 4 if you wanted to, etc. As I mentioned before, you can also have a multi-line entry field. And if it exceeds the size on your screen, it'll automatically create that scroll area. Okay. When you set up your entry field, you can name the field. It'll default to entry 1, entry 2, entry 3, and so on. And you can name the variable. You can leave it as entry 0001. I personally like to rename my variables so that later when I'm using it, I know which entry field I'm talking about. Because if you remember that form I just showed you, that example I showed you, there were 7 or 8 entry fields. So this one might be called first name. I might name this variable first name. And then I know later when I need the first name, that's the one I'm looking for, as opposed to remember which entry number it is. There's default text that you can set. And what that means in the case of form objects, default text is not only the text that will appear when it first comes up, as it did here. As you may recall, this text was in the field when it first came up. So it's not only the text that will appear in the field, but in the case of an entry field, remember that the text is also the value. So this is the default text and the default or initial value for that entry field. You can set a background color from the color palette, same as always. And as I mentioned, you can limit the number of characters or increase the number of characters allowed in that field. Here's where we can select multi-line, and that gives you the difference between an entry field without a scroll bar and an entry field that will have a scroll bar. You can also make an entry field password only, and what that will do is put asterisks in the field as they type. They won't see the actual values of the characters they're typing. And that's how you can create or simulate logins, for example. You can make an entry field read-only. So for example, perhaps on one page of a form you have them enter some data. On another page of the form you want to show them the data that they entered but not allow them to change it. You make that second version of the entry field read-only. And the other thing you can do, by the way, because you can do simulations, and you often see the same field, like a name field, for example, repeated on multiple pages, you can set the value of the variable to be the same as it was before. So if this is first name, and on page 7, that first name field shows up again, I can just name that one first name as well, and those two will always stay in sync. And then down here, you can also retain value between sessions. So if you're doing a simulation, and you want them to be able to come back sort of where they left off, you can select that value as well. And you should be familiar with that from questions. That's how we keep the value of a question from one session to another if you want to. And the other things here, of course, you already know what to do. So that is our entry field. Again, that's this one right here on your toolbar that has AB in it. The next one we're going to look at is the radio button and radio button group. Well, what's the difference? The difference is, and I'm not quite sure why you would, but you could have radio buttons that are not part of a group that would allow all of these to be selected independently. Most of the time, though, you see radio buttons as part of a radio button group or a radio group, which then tells Lectora only allow one of them at a time to be selected. So this would be analogous to, for example, your true, false, or multiple choice question. That's how those work. So a radio button group is this icon right here. When you select that, there will be nothing placed on your actual page in your title. It just shows up in your left-hand pane in your Title Explorer. And then under that radio button group, you start adding as many radio buttons as you need to create the simulation that you wanted. In this simulation we were looking at today, there were only 2 fields. I believe it was user and form or free form. So it was sort of a toggle between 2. But you can have as many radio buttons as you need to. If your radio buttons are not in a group, then they will have their own variable value. And again, you can rename it, just as you wanted to, a contact source or whatever it is. If they are in a radio button group or a radio group, they will not have an independent value, but in fact, the group will have a value, and the associated value will be which radio button was selected. Okay? So in other words, if these buttons are in a group, right now radio 1 is selected, so the value of the variable associated with my radio group is radio 1. Or if this were called dog, cat, and parrot, then dog would be the value right now in my variable. Okay? I have no idea how I came up with dog and cat and parrot. All right, so that's radio buttons and radio groups. The thing on radio buttons is you can default the text to be on the left side or the right side. You can indicate which one, if any, is initially selected when they come to the page. And again, you can retain the value. All right, let's go on to the next one. The next one we'll look at is a checkbox. Checkboxes are very similar to radio buttons. Again, you can name the object whatever you want, and you can also name the variable whatever you want. And again, if you're repeating something that was on a previous page, you can also select and use that same variable name that you used before, thus ensuring that the checkbox on page 5 represents what was selected on page 2. Oh, one other thing I kind of skipped over, and I'll mention this briefly here. All of these have an onSelect change as well. And you can attach an action to that. In other words, if they select this checkbox, if they turn this checkbox on or change it, turn it off, is there something else that I want to do? So that's something you can remember as well. You don't have to evaluate the whole screen at once. You can do things one at a time if you want to as well. We'll look at that in a minute. All right, so special properties then of checkboxes. Again, you can say put the text on the left or on the right. Most common is on the right. Again, you can determine whether that checkbox is initially on or selected or not. And of course, you can retain that value as well. Okay. So let me just come back up here for just a second, because I know this gets a little confusing sometimes to people. Name is the name of the object in your Title Explorer. Your student never sees that. Your title, if you will, never sees that. Your values never see that. That's strictly for you. The variable name is what you're going to track and use later. So this might be smoking. Maybe you have a health form, and if someone smokes, you check that box. If they don't smoke, you leave it unchecked. So you might call this variable, do they smoke, or smoking. Okay? And the label is what shows up next to the checkbox. This is what will be the value that's read actually by a screen reader, for example. So if this were my form and a screen reader were reading this, they would read initially visible as the name of this checkbox. And as you can see, the value of this checkbox is on. All right? So checkboxes and radio buttons have a value of on or blank, and radio groups have a value of the name of the radio button that is selected. Let me say that one more time just so you can make sure you're clear. Checkboxes and radio buttons have a value of on or blank. Radio groups have the value of whichever label, the name of the label of whichever one is selected. Let's go on to the next object. Or I guess in this case I'm going to do the next two objects. And that is the drop-down list and the list box. Those are these objects right here. Drop-down list is this kind of thing. And a list box is the one that allows you to multi-select within a list. They work very similarly. Again, you have a name. That's the name that appears in your Title Explorer, your left-hand pane. You have the variable, whatever you want to call that particular value, so you can find it later and use it later. You can set default background colors. You can determine whether this drop-down list or list box is visible on the page or not. All of these things are sort of the same. And you can indicate what items are actually in your list, of course. And the way you do that is you click Add. It pops up a little dialog, and you can just put in as many items as you want in your list. Just do a line return between each one. Another little trick, by the way, if you have a long list, like let's say you're doing the list of the 50 states, because you've got a form that simulates that, when you do add, that dialog that pops up actually allows you to paste. So what I will often do if I have a long list, I'll do my long list in a spreadsheet where I can spell check it and everything else, and then I'll just copy it, click add here, and paste it in, and they all go in at one time. I don't have to type them all again, and I know they're all correct. It's a little tip for you. Okay, so a couple unique things here. The other thing you can do is you can indicate which of these, if any, is initially selected when that drop-down list or list box first appears. And with a list box, you can allow it to be multi-select. So this would be equivalent to a multiple choice question in a drop list. This would be equivalent to a multiple choice question with multiple correct answers in a list box. And then the last element that we have not talked about, and is kind of key, is the actual form element. Now, what is a form element? Well, we've had all these form objects. This form object is this little guy right here. Looks like a summary of everything. With the form object, nothing will actually show up on your page. Again, this is only going to appear in your Title Explorer. But what happens is once you create a form object, you can put all of these items, all your checkboxes and radio buttons and entry fields and drop lists and list boxes. If you put them on a form, what that will do is a couple things. It will allow you to, first of all, reset the form with a button or on show of a page or however. So anytime they come to that form, it will wipe out any existing information and make the form look like it looked the first time with whatever you had initially selected, and so forth. The other important thing that it does is this will determine the tab order when someone's actually going through your simulation. So if you put them all on a form, it will tab through each of these, and they hit the tab key, it will tab through each of these items in sequence. That's how that's determined. And also, this is the order in which a screen reader is going to read them as well, if you're going to be 508 compliant. So again, we've got the form object itself, that's here, under which we can add on any radio buttons, which typically we put inside a radio group, which tells it only one can be selected at a time. The value of this radio group variable is going to be either radio 1 or radio 2 or radio 3, or whatever you actually name them. We have entry fields where they can put in any value they want, numeric or alphabetic. Checkboxes, and those are going to be on or off. Drop lists, which are these kind of things, and list boxes. Now, to actually turn this into a simulation, you have to be able to tell what's in each field. So let's talk about that a little bit. And this is where we're going to sort of drift over into another Inspiration Wednesday session where we talked about conditional actions. So we're going to bring a little bit of that into play here. When you do an action, and we all do a million actions, usually you're telling Lectora to do something. On mouse click, on page show, on mouse enter, on done playing of a video, whatever it is, you want to do something, okay? That's typically what an action is. But for those of you that haven't used it, there are, of course, two other tabs on every action dialog, a condition and an else. And what this tells Lectora to do is do this action if this condition is true. Okay, so if in the case of that reported by field, the value selected of those radio buttons in that radio group is customer, if that radio group contains the value of customer, then do what I wanted you to do. Okay, in this case, display a message. If this is not true, in other words, if it's false, you also have the option of saying do something else. And that's what the else tab does for you. So basically, this is how we do if-then statements in Lectora. Do something if this condition is true, do something else, perhaps, if this condition is false. All right? So let's look at these. The do part you actually, and the else part you get, because that's just performing an action. We do actions all the time. Let's take a look here in the middle at this condition part. Conditions are made up of three components: a variable, that is what you will compare to a value; the relationship, what that comparison needs to be for it to be true; and the value, which would be the true statement of that variable. In other words, if this is true, then I want to do my do action. If this is false, I'm not going to do the do action. And if I have an else action, I'm going to instead do that else action. Okay, so let's say we have a variable, and we'll call it reported by. And then you have a relationship. There are lots of relationships you can choose from in Lectora. Contains, does not contain, equal to, is not equal to, which you can't see here, but I'll scroll down to it. Greater than or equal. For questions, you have the option of is correct or is not correct. For fields, you also have the option of is empty or is not empty. And then less than and less than equal to. All right, so these are the relationships you can choose. You can say, so is reported by equal to, for example, some value? Or does the reported by, where'd it go? Here it is. Contain some value. Okay? That's the relationships. Value you can enter in three ways. There are only two showing here. I will mention the third, but it's rarely used. You can enter a specific value, for example, customer, right? We said was reported by equal to customer. Okay? Or you could enter a variable value and say is reported by equal to the same value that's in the variable of something else. Okay? So you can use that capital VAR left parenthesis, whatever variable you're trying to compare it to, and right parenthesis. You can use that syntax. So this would say is the reported by variable, is the value in that variable equal to whatever the value is in this ND variable. Okay. Now I want to come back for a second to this relationship, to this equal to and contains and so on. When you say equal to, it is looking for an exact match. So for example, let's say, is this equal to boat? Okay. Well, if you say equal to, Lectora is going to look at all the ways that boat could be in here and say, is it equal to this? And of all of these ways that I have boat, the only one that is equal to this is lowercase b, lowercase o, lowercase a, lowercase t. That is the only one that is equal to this. This one has a big O in it. This one has a big A and a big T in it. This one has a big O, as you can tell here where I'm going, right? Equal to means exactly equal to. So numerically, we understand what that means. That's easy. But in a text string, you have to be careful that you're dealing with upper and lower case and spacing and so on. So I wanted to point that out to you. Equal to means equal to. Contains, by the way, means contains these characters. So for example, if I had boater, okay, in this field, or maybe my variable was boater, and I had this as contains B-O-A-T, well, boater contains B-O-A-T, so then it would pass. So that's how you need to think about it. Another example, my name up here on the right. My name equals capital D, little a, little r, little y, little l, but it contains a. It contains AR. It contains ARY. All right? All of those things are in that container. So that's how you want to think about the relationships. So again, I'm going to go backwards for just a second. We've got what do we want Lectora to do? Maybe it's continue on to the next page of your simulation, perhaps. If whatever conditions you identify on your condition panel are met, are true, and if they're not true, what else do we want to do? Maybe it's display an error message, like you would often see in a system simulation, or do something else. Now the other thing I want to point out You do not have to have only single conditions. You can do multiple conditions. All right? You can say, I want to do something if all of these conditions are true. Clearance does not contain this and does not contain that, meaning it does not contain A or B, but it contains whatever other options are in my drop list. You could also say, do something if any of the following are true. So if it does not contain general, or it does not contain B general. So keep in mind, all equals and. This and this and this and this and this and this have to all be true for the condition to be met. Any means or. This or this or this or this. Any of these, any one of these, if any one of these is true, your condition is true and it will execute your do action. Okay? All equals and, any equals or. All right, let's go a little step further. So now we've got our screen capture. We've laid on our form objects. We've got a button or whatever where we're going to measure or evaluate what the student put in that simulated system. We've figured out what our conditions are that we need. And now we have to do a bunch of actions to compare it. Well, this is a little bit tricky, and again, I'll encourage you to go out to our website and view the Inspiration Wednesday session on conditional actions, and it goes into this a little bit more deeply. But the way Lectora works is if you have a bunch of actions, it will just read straight through all the actions. Well, you don't want that if you're trying to do a compound condition. You want it to be able to stop and give an error message or whatever, and not just read all the way through. And the way we accomplish that is with action groups. An action group is just like if you group a bunch of images, they're in a group, and you can hide or show that group all at once. Well, the same thing is kind of true with actions. If you put a bunch of actions, or one or many actions, in a group, you can run or not run all those actions all at once. And an action group will only run when you tell it to. So that's how I do compound conditions, is I put each separate piece in a different action group, and then it will only get to that action group if it passes the previous set of conditions. All right? So let's walk through a couple examples of that, and then we'll look at an actual form. So let's say we have this situation. We want something that is A, whatever that condition is, A, and conditions B or C. Well, you recall back here, I'll go back one, my choices for conditions are all of these or any of these. There is no condition for all of these with any of these. So you have to kind of put it together. So the way you do that is I have this action here that says run the second part, go on to action group 2, if whatever I was looking for in this first part is met. So if this is met, then it'll look for the second part. If this is not met, if it's false, if that condition is false, then I'll do an error message or whatever I want to do to say, you know what, this whole thing cannot be true because already this part wasn't true. If that first part is true, then it tells it my do action is to run action group number 2, which then checks to see if B or C is true. So I can do ors together and I can do ands together, but I can't do ands and ors all at the same time. So that's what this does. Go to the next page in the simulation, go to action group 2 if my entry field contains a name. Oh, it contained a name, great. Does it also contain a phone number or email address? If it does, continue on. If it doesn't, then do whatever I want with an error message or something. Let's look at one a little bit more complicated. This one we have these have to be there, or both of these have to be there, or both of these have to be there, or all three of these have to be there, whatever that means for whatever those fields are. So we kind of do the same thing. Although sometimes you have to flip it on its head a little bit. But in this case, what we're doing is we look to see if A and B, whatever those conditions are, exist. If those conditions exist, then we can just go on to the next thing, right? Because this says, if any of these things occurs, we're good to go. Well, if that occurs, we're good to go. We're off and running. If that does not occur, in this case, Then we'll check the next group and see if this condition exists. If it does, we go off and do whatever it is we wanted to do, because now we know this string is met because at least one of these things has been satisfied. So the difference is, in this example, we ran the action group if this was all contained to then check the next thing. In this case, we ran the action group if this wasn't contained to check the next thing. So you have to kind of just figure out which way you want to go. So in this case, we look for A and B. If A and B isn't there, we'll look for C and D. If C and D isn't there, we'll look for F or G. If F or G isn't there, we'll look for H, I, and J. And if H, I, and J isn't there, then we'll say, nah, you got a problem. Okay? None of those were satisfied. And in this last example, we have kind of a mix of all of those things. But we're doing the same sort of thing. Look for A. If A is there, then let's look for B or C. If B or C isn't there, then we know we don't even have to check the rest of the string because it already failed this part of the condition, and we can just go on and exit out and show our error. If it is there, we'll go on and look and see if this part of the condition is satisfied. So this is how you can build pretty complex simulations using action groups. Just take each piece, separate what you need to look at, and only go to that piece if it's satisfied the previous things you're looking at. All right, I've probably got a bunch of you guys scratching your head here. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to actually look at a real example. We'll see how that works, and then we'll go underneath the hood and into Lectora and look at the actual form fields there. All right, so here's our criteria. We've got this simulation that we've built using our screen captures and our form fields, and we've provided some data to our users, either in a pop-up or maybe an exercise guide or something like that. So now we're going to test if they actually know how to navigate our little system simulation that we built. So we want them to, on this form here, and by the way, I built this form by taking a screen capture of a little tab interface and laying on top of it my drop-down lists, multi-line entry fields, radio buttons, which I put in a group so it toggles back and forth, as you can see, checkboxes, single-line entry fields, and multi-selectable list box. Okay, so what we have to do here, we're asking our student to fill out this little incident card. We're testing to see if they know how to do the incident card. So the first thing we asked is they have to put in the right type of abuse or fraud. All right. Well, here you can see we've got a bunch of different things. All right, so they can choose abuse or fraud. Let's pick check kiting. We'll come over here. Notice that they only have 2 options available for priority if they pick check kiting. But if they pick abuse, they've got 4 options. That's what I meant by sort of that conditional hide show. And really what we're doing here, we're just tricking Lectora. We're saying show the one that has 4 options if they pick one of these, show the one that has 2 options if they pick one of those. So that's all. There are actually 2 drop lists here, and we're just switching which one the student actually sees based on their choice in this checkbox. So we're going to pick check kiting, and we're going to pick B. Let's see, priority. Well, let's get it right to start with. Why not? We'll pick abuse, and A for abuse. If we had picked fraud, then we'd have to pick B for fraud. Okay? We'll say reported by the customer. They have to put in an email or a phone number. We'll put in an email of bjones@security.net. Let's see. We'll put in a description of suspected, in this case, fraud, since we chose fraud. And if it's fraud, we need to choose a clearance of D. And we've got D selected. Let's see if we pass this. You entered the correct information. Well done. So using that sort of compound answer analysis, we were able to simulate this actual incident form. Now let's get something wrong. Let's change this to other. And in here we'll change this to abuse. So we've got fraud selected with a priority of B. We've got other selected, abuse, and let's also take out that. All right, so now we say that the scenario data is not correct. Try again. All right, so let's try to get everything correct. We've got fraud. We're good there. B, it's supposed to be a fraud. That's good. This is supposed to be customer. Maybe that was our problem. Nope, we still don't have it quite right. Let's see, we have to have an email or a phone number. So we'll put in a phone number this time. 555-987-6543. All right, so maybe that did it. Nope, we still have some incorrect data. What else? Well, this says fraud and this says abuse. All right, so let's put in fraud here. Maybe that did it. Yep, that did it. Now we've satisfied all of these conditions. All right, so that's how you can simulate an application in Lectora. So what I want to do now is jump out of my little presentation, jump back into Lectora, and actually look at how these things are set up. All right. Okay, so here's our little incident form. And I'm just going to jump down here. And you can see I've got a bunch of groups, and all of these are action groups, like we just discussed, and I'll go through those in just a second. The first thing you'll notice here is we've got our dialog blank. That's our screen capture right there. Not very exciting. Then I laid on top of that a title that's here. And I laid on a form object. Now remember, a form object does not show up on your page, okay, but it gives you a place to put all the other things that do show up on the page, such as the type and the drop list for type. Here's a drop list. You see you can click add, and you can add other values to the list if you want to, or as I said, you could paste in here as well if you had a long list. I've indicated that I want unknown to be initially selected. So when they first get to this page, you'll see unknown is selected. Okay. The other thing I want to point out, by the way, here on type, this is just a text block, but you'll notice I selected this label for and then type field. If you're being 508 compliant, this is how a screen reader knows what's next. So this tells the screen reader that this label called type is associated with this drop-down list. So I always put them in right before the one that they're supposed to relate to. Okay. Here's another form object. It's our entry field. In this case, it's a multi-line entry field. Right. And again, we can tell it how many characters we want it to have. If we wanted it to be password only, we could check that field. And then when the student enters in, you would not see the actual characters in the field. Okay. Now let's take that off and let's leave that on. All right. Let's see what else we have here. Here we've got a radio button, 2 radio buttons actually. We put these radio buttons in a group, so that tells Lectora only one of them can be selected at a time. And the value of this variable called reported by is going to be either customer or other, because that's the label that we put on these radio buttons. So when we're checking that simulation, we're checking the variable reported by has a value equal to customer or other. We were checking to see if the type variable had a value of abuse or fraud. That's how we're doing this. I'll come back to the switching priority trick in just a second. That sort of dynamically populating box. We'll come back to that in just a second. A little further down, we've got the email checkbox and the phone number checkbox. These don't need to have labels, by the way, from a 508 standpoint, because they already have their own labels built into them. So when we're checking to see if email or phone is selected, what we're looking for is email equal to on, or is phone equal to on? Remember, the value of checkboxes is on or blank, on or nothing. Here's another entry field for phone number. It's a single line entry field. okay, versus the multi-line entry field we had here. And here is our clearance list box that works just like a drop list, only we've set this one to allow multi-select for clearance. Okay, so we've got a little form set up. Let's take a look. Oh, I'm sorry, I almost skipped this little dipsy-do here. All right, so here we've got, as you can actually see, I have two drop lists. One for priority 1 that contains A, B, C, and D. One for priority 2 that just contains A and B. And I put both of these on their own little form so that I can use that reset form trick. So every time they change it, it resets it back to the original. That way I don't get leftover stuff hanging around. So that's all this is. And I made one of them initially visible, so something shows up when you start the form, and one of them is not visible. Okay? And all I did here was back when they select the type, on select change, I run some priority actions. And those priority actions say, where is that? Here we go. It runs this group of actions. And this group of actions says, hide both of them, and then reset both of them, and then show the first one if they chose unknown or abuse. If that's false, show the second one. So it looks like it's a dynamically populating drop-down list with 4 choices or 2 choices, but it's really not. I'm just cheating. I'm just hiding them and showing the one that needs to be shown based on what's picked in the type field. It's a little trick that you can use to sort of make it look like it's dynamic if that's what your application actually does. Okay, let's take a look now at the actions. So when we clicked OK on that form, all we did was run action group number 1. In other words, start our sequence of looking through the form elements. Here's action group number 1. It says go to action group number 2 if they chose abuse or fraud. Because remember, our scenario said they had to choose abuse or fraud. So if this is true, if they choose any of the following, either abuse or fraud, continue checking. If they didn't choose abuse or fraud, run our action group display error message. And all that is a message that says your data was incorrect. Now, by the way, you may be wondering, why did I say run an action group to display the error message versus just having the action of display message? The reason I did that is because in all of these situations that I still have to check, I have to provide a message. And I'm lazy. I didn't want to have to type the message for every single action, so I just said put the action in one place here, and then every time the else action is the same, it just says if something is wrong, run the error group, And that way I could also highlight if I wanted to or whatever else. So that's why I did that. Okay, so the first action says to check the type. It says go to the second group if the type is what we want. The second group says continue on to the third group if the type is abuse and they've chosen A as the priority, or continue on to the next group if the type is fraud and they've chosen B as the priority. If the type is abuse but they did not choose A, then we're going to go and do our error message. All right? So do the error message if they chose abuse but they did not choose A. Show the error message if they chose fraud but did not choose B. Remember, it'll never get here unless they chose fraud or abuse anyway, so it has to be one of those two. So then we just look to see if they got picked the right thing. If it passes that, it runs the next group. The next group says continue to the following group if reported by is equal to customer. Remember, this is either going to be customer or other. So if it passes that, continue on. If it doesn't pass that, show our error. And it just continues on down like that, checking everything all the way through. And that's how we did it. All right, so you can do some pretty effective simulations. Now, one other thing I want to point out here before I leave this today and try to look at any of the questions. I mentioned early on that these form objects are the same things you see in questions, right? radio buttons like multiple choice questions, or list boxes like you could have in a multiple choice question, drop-down list, etc. Well, I've got a question for you. How many pages are you allowed to have in a test? Well, the answer is you can have as many pages as you want in a test. Okay? Well, how many questions can you have on a page? Well, the answer is you can have as many questions on a page as you want. Right? Okay, so then the next question is there any special way you have to place your questions on a page? Well, no, you can put them wherever you want. Well, if I can have as many pages in a test as I want, and I can have as many questions on a page as I want, and I can arrange those questions any way I want, then why can't I do my test like this? Okay, so let me just run this for you. This is actually a test. Only instead of showing the question, I'm only showing the entry field for the question. Okay, so in my exercise workbook, I've given them some data that they need to enter into this form. I'll put in something here. We'll choose something. So you've seen this form before. It's the same form we already built. I'll get something else wrong here. We'll click submit, and now it's scoring it just like a test. Because as far as Lectora is concerned, these are just questions, right? So I was supposed to enter, and I did, fraud 22 as the incident name. I was supposed to choose user as my against source, and I did, right? So I was supposed to choose Fleary as my last name. Did I get anything wrong in here? Maybe I didn't. Oh, yeah, I did right here. I was supposed to choose Mexico as my country, or excuse me, choose Spain as my country, and I entered Mexico. All right. So this is actually a test, and all I did. Let's just go back here so I can show you. It's the same thing it was before, only instead of using an entry field, a plain entry field, I used a fill-in-the-blank question. Here's the question text right here. I just made the question text not visible. So the student doesn't see the question text, but it will show up on the test results so they can tell what they missed. And here's the entry field for that question. Here's a true-false question right here. We look at this one. This is actually just a true-false. Remember, a true-false question, the choices don't have to be true or false. They can be user and user form. They can be whatever you want them to be, any two choices. Okay? This is a multiple choice question right here. Well, I'm sorry, wrong one. Right here. I didn't evaluate everything on this. So here we have a multiple choice question, only we've said display it as a drop-down list. So once you understand that these objects are all the same, you can do a lot of neat things with it. Right? If I take off this background, there's nothing there. This is all just questions on my page. So that's how you can do some pretty neat things in Lectora using form objects. And now that you understand form objects, you can also do questions because that's the same thing. I want to thank everyone for joining again today. I hope you're inspired to try something new and do things a little bit differently in your titles. And again, there's no magic. It's just using those form elements that Lectora has provided for you. So thanks very much, folks, and have a good day.